Alright, chess fans, we're here on my third video of the Rocky Mountain Team Chess Challenge featuring Preston Herrington, the doctor from New Mexico, and Dan Picard from Colorado. They have pretty similar ratings. Dan Picard has a rating edge. He's 1623. Preston Herrington, going into at least at the supplement, was 1550, I believe, or somewhere thereabouts. After the first two results we looked at, um, uh, Colorado won on board 6, I mean, and New Mexico won on board 7, bringing the total tally to 1 game apiece at this point. So let's go ahead and look at their pictures. Preston Herrington is here on the right, and Dan Picard shaking his hand on the left. A couple of mean-looking hombres. So let's go ahead and get into the match. So Dan Picard plays the birds, f4. It's actually a mainstay of a couple of New Mexican players, Dante Archuleta and Robert Hampton. And actually, quite a few people play it, sporadically. Preston Herrington played the G6 variation. It looks like the fianchetto, which is probably the most challenging, based off of my recollection of computer analysis, and also I know that Dante's told me that you know probably the hardest one to play against. Um, so, all right, so Dan Picard plays like a fianchetto, not fianchetto, a stonewall type setup versus the bird. I mean, as the bird. The only thing I don't like about this is obviously the bishop at c1 is kind of, it's not into the game, and it has very little prospect for getting into the game with pawns on e4 and f4, putting on the double block. The knight, we'll see. I'm not exactly sure. I like the way that Dan Picard is developing. You know, moving the knight twice really quickly into the center. A lot of times, I think if I were him, just to go back a bit, I think I would prefer to hold off and play a setup like d3, which is real common in the bird. But also, when they play, just make any moves, they'll play. The common thing is the plan is to play for this queen e1, queen h4 stuff, bring the knight to g5 or whatever, and force black to defend. Either defend with a solid fortress, that it can come up with in advance, or force black to create some weaknesses by moving pawns on his king side. So I'm not exactly sure, first off, that I like the immediate knight e5, and knight d4 is super solid, but it's not, I think it's kind of inflexible. So rook f3, he goes for an early rook lift. I'm not sure, I don't know, I kind of think I would favor queen e1 first, but he goes right at him. So his plan is apparent. It's clear. He's gonna just attack the king. Typically, I would say that right now the rook seems somewhat out of place. I mean, clearly it's eyeing h7, but there's no threat there, and without creating some weakness, there isn't. It's in a peculiar place. Typically, I'll say this. Typically in the bird, in these lines, you'll see one of two breaks. Something like, after d3, whatever, you'll see a d4 break. It doesn't work here, but that's a common break you see with that setup. Or to go back to the game, you might see a f5 break, and now might not be the place for it. But you see one of those two breaks to create some weakness or gain control of the center. F5 is more, just pure attacking. So based off of Dan's, inclination to attack, I would say that an F5 break might be more suitable for him. Instead of, moving his rook several times without an attack really set up. So knight e4, I think I like knight e4 and I like c5. They both seem to get a stake into the center. A lot of times, one of the general rules, and chess has a ton of general rules, but one of the general rules that's usually pretty good is that when your opponent's attacking you on the flank, you should attack in the center. And here, that's what Preston is doing. So knight takes knight. It seems fine. D takes would have also been reasonable. If the pawn, for example, were at e4, it really locks in that e3 pawn. Granted, it doubles Preston's pawns, but with that pawn on e3 locked up like that, it's really hard for the bishop on c1 to do much of anything. And also, the rook becomes, even more vulnerable to something as simple like, bishop c8, and then what? If the rook goes to g3, then it's really out of place because it's staring down the g6, well-supported pawn. Or it can go to h4, which is really the destination for the queen in White's apparent plan. So, e takes would have been pretty good. Also, it's threatening immediately. Pawn takes pawn, queen takes. So White's going to have to play something like c3, which, I mean, it's not awful, but at this point it kind of wastes a move. Or at least the point is he gets to take on e4 with tempo. So, all right. Well, let's get back to the game. Oops. So he took, and then knight takes. It's a reasonable move. Queen h4. I can say at least Dan is really sticking to his plan. He's just going all out at Preston's king. And it does seem like it's a little harder to defend right now. I mean, if Preston were to play knight f6, then knight g4 is coming. Either way, Preston's going to have to play something to stop him. He's going to have to choose h6 or h5. h5 looks like it probably loses, just the bishop takes. Well, I don't know about loses, but g4 is testing, and bishop takes h5 is also interesting. So h6, oops, and that's what's played. So g4. Now he continues with the pawn storm. g5, and he basically creates a dark square blockade here. And it seems like a pretty good defensive resource. Typically I don't think you should really, you should try to avoid moving your pawns when you're being attacked. For example, I would, instead of moving my pawns typically, what I would do is I would play something like bring the rook to e8 and play like the knight on f8. And the knight on f8 would hold the h7 and g6 squares. I mean, it's a good defensive resource typically. Plus, the knight on f8 would be less vulnerable to things, moves like knight g4 or whatever, which can deflect the defender. And it's not always the best scenario. You want to be careful from being too passive. But it seems like Preston came up with a pretty good defensive resource.